People complain about the harshness of the modern world, but if you look back into history, you'll realize that human beings once survived punishments so extreme that they eclipsed anything we fear today. These methods weren't myths or exaggerated tales. They were real, documented, and brutally executed. Let's begin our journey into the 20 most horrific punishments ever recorded, starting with number 20. 20. Ponacole, the Roman punishment for parent killers in ancient Rome. Not all murders were treated equally. Different types of killings brought different degrees of punishment, and among them, parricide, murdering one's own mother or father, was considered the ultimate act of evil. Those found guilty faced an execution so bizarre and terrifying that even hardened criminals trembled at its name. The ritual was known as ponacole. Once convicted, the offender's fate unfolded through a sequence of humiliating and horrifying steps. First came a brutal scourging, a beating severe enough to terrify most people even without what followed next. After the flogging, the condemned had a wolfskin hood forced over their head, plunging them into darkness and symbolically stripping them of humanity. Then came another layer of torment. Wooden-soled clogs strapped onto their feet, making even the slightest movement torturous. But the true nightmare began when they were stuffed into a thick leather sack, and they weren't alone inside it. Along with them were thrown a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, not as companions, but as living instruments of chaos and terror. Once sewn inside this writhing, suffocating prison, the sack was loaded onto a cart pulled by black oxen. It was carried to a river or the sea, where it was thrown into the water. Inside that confined space, darkness, panic, and the frantic animals added a final layer of horror before drowning claimed the victim. Interestingly, this punishment was rarely used. According to the historian Suetonius, it was mostly reserved for those who outright confessed. In 118 CE, Emperor Hadrian offered an alternative punishment, being thrown to wild beasts. Within a century, ponacule disappeared entirely, abandoned as too grotesque even for ancient Rome. 19. Drawing and quartering, England's punishment for treason. If you think nothing could surpass the horror of number 20, history has more in store. Drawing and quartering, used in England from the 1200s until 1867, was a punishment reserved exclusively for traitors, those who betrayed the crown. The process began with drawing, where the accused was tied behind a horse and dragged to the execution site. Hanging often followed, but usually only partially, just enough to weaken, not kill. In some cases, the victim's abdomen was cut open, and their internal organs were removed or burned before them. But the final step was the most gruesome: quartering. The person's arms and legs were tied to separate horses, each driven in opposite directions. With enough force, the body was torn apart. The limbs ripped from the torso in a macabre and public display meant to terrify onlookers. The dismembered pieces were then sent to different corners of the city as a chilling warning of the price of treason. The severed pieces of the victim's body were often taken to different corners of the city and displayed as a chilling reminder of what awaited traitors. Now that we've covered that, let's continue the countdown. Number 18, often referred to as slow slicing or the infamous death by 1,000 cuts, was one of the most excruciating execution methods ever practiced in ancient China. This form of torture persisted for centuries, with records tracing its use back to the 10th century. Thankfully, it was permanently abolished in 1905. The process was disturbingly methodical. The condemned person was bound to a wooden post, unable to move, and the executioner began removing pieces of flesh, slice by slice. Each cut was deliberate, intended to prolong the victim's suffering for as long as possible. Sometimes the procedure ended with a final strike to the heart. In other cases, decapitation delivered the last blow. Few punishments in history were as deliberately drawn out and psychologically tormenting as Ling Chi. Number 17, cropping of ears. Next on the list is a punishment as brutal as its name suggests: ear cropping. This penalty involved cutting off one or both ears of the convicted person as a form of permanent humiliation and social punishment. In milder cases, instead of removing the ears entirely, the ears were nailed to a wooden pillory, forcing the individual to stand immobile for an agonizing stretch of time before being released. Although this method didn't always kill the victim, it left lifelong disfigurement and deep psychological trauma. Infections were common, and in an era without modern medicine, many eventually died from untreated wounds. Number 16, death by boiling. Next, horrific method brings us to the practice of boiling people alive, a punishment that feels almost unreal by today's standards, but was common in both Europe and Asia centuries ago. The condemned were stripped naked, thrown into a huge metal cauldron, and submerged in boiling water, oil, or even tar dot in some cases. The liquid started cool, and the heat was gradually increased, prolonging the agony with cruel precision. Historical accounts from the reign of King Henry VIII reveal that some victims suffered for nearly 2 hours before dying. The origins of this punishment stretch back to ancient Rome under Emperor Nero, who reportedly used boiling as a method of killing early Christians. During the 1500s, Henry VIII made poisoning a crime punishable by boiling alive, possibly driven by his own paranoia about being poisoned. This horrific law did not survive long, and after Henry's death, his son Edward VI abolished the practice, effectively ending one of history's most grotesque punishments. Number 15. Sawing in half. The next nightmare on this list is one that appeared in multiple civilizations, including ancient Rome, Spain, and several regions across Asia. Sawing in half was exactly what it sounds like. The victim was cut into 2 sections, often while still alive. This execution was frequently carried out in public, turning death into a spectacle meant to terrify the crowd and discourage rebellion or crime. The brutality of the procedure, and the fact that it targeted a living body, made it one of the most shocking punishments ever conceived. This form of execution involved the gradual removal of a victim's internal organs while they were still conscious, forcing them to endure unimaginable suffering until death mercifully arrived. With that, we move forward to number 14. Crushed by an elephant. This brutal method of execution was widely used in ancient India and in several parts of Southeast Asia. Because elephants were powerful, intelligent, and easily trained, rulers turned them into living weapons. These massive animals could end a life instantly or prolong the agony depending on the executioner's command. The condemned individual would be positioned under the feet of a trained elephant. Sometimes the order was given for a quick execution, with the elephant crushing the skull or chest in a single devastating stomp. However, in harsher cases, the elephant was trained to torture rather than kill immediately, stepping on limbs first, breaking bones one at a time, dragging the victim, or applying pressure slowly to prolong the agony. Witnessing this would have been horrifying. The sheer weight of the largest land mammal being used as a tool of punishment created a spectacle that terrified all who watched. This method was primarily practiced in regions where elephants were native, especially across South and Southeast Asia. Not only did humans suffer, but even the majestic animals were forced into a role of cruelty they never chose. Now, let's continue with number 13. The brazen bull. Prepare yourself, because this device is considered one of the most depraved inventions in recorded history. Known as the brazen bull or the Sicilian bull, it originated in ancient Greece. Designed by order of the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily during the 6th century BCE, Phalaris, infamous for his merciless rule, wanted a punishment that reflected his brutal nature. The contraption was shaped like a full-sized bronze bull, hollow on the inside. The condemned person was forced into the chamber through a small opening. Once trapped inside, a fire was lit beneath the bronze structure, causing the metal to heat gradually until the victim was roasted alive. But the cruelty didn't stop there. The bull was engineered with a system of pipes that turned the victim's screams into sounds resembling an enraged bull. The horrifying mixture of heat, suffocation, and distorted cries made this device one of the most sadistic torture instruments ever conceived. Even Phalaris himself, notorious for his viciousness, was said to be disturbed when he first witnessed the bull's effects. In a grim twist of fate, the inventor of the device, Parellos, was the very first person forced inside it. Phalaris ordered him to demonstrate the bull, and once Parellos was trapped, the fire was lit. Although Parellos was reportedly removed before death, Phalaris later had him thrown off a cliff, proving his cruelty had no limit. Some ancient accounts even claim Phalaris eventually died inside the same brazen bull during an uprising. With that, we move on to number 12. The punishment of the Vestal Virgins. Exploration of history's darkest punishments now brings us back to ancient Rome, where the Vestal Virgins played a sacred and highly respected role. These priestesses served the goddess Vesta, the divine protector of home and hearth. Their position was symbolic. They represented purity, stability, and the spiritual well-being of Rome. To maintain this sanctity, Vestal virgins were required to take a vow of lifelong chastity. Breaking this vow was considered not only a personal failure, but a threat to the safety and moral order of the entire city. However, executing a Vestal virgin directly was forbidden, since their bodies were considered sacred. Instead, a terrifying alternative was devised. The condemned priestess was led through the streets, publicly shamed, and taken to a sealed underground chamber with a small amount of food and water. She was then left inside and buried, alive, a death designed to preserve Roman religious law, while delivering a grim fate to the one who broke her sacred vow. One of the strictest requirements placed upon the Vestal virgins was their lifelong vow of celibacy. They were forbidden from engaging in any form of sexual activity, as their purity was believed to safeguard the spiritual balance of Rome. Their chastity was not simply a personal commitment. It represented the protection, stability, and divine favor of the entire city. But the penalty for breaking this sacred oath was severe. A Vestal virgin who violated her vow faced execution, though not by ordinary means. Because these priestesses were considered holy, shedding their blood directly was thought to offend the gods. For that reason, an alternative method was devised that preserved religious customs while delivering an unthinkably harsh punishment. The condemned Vestal would be publicly escorted through the streets of Rome, her fall from grace displayed before the citizens she once symbolized. This procession ended near the Colline Gate, where a small underground chamber awaited her. Inside, she was provided only a lamp, a little water, and a bit of food, just enough to technically avoid killing her outright. Once she entered, the entrance was sealed, trapping her alive beneath the earth. She would slowly die in isolation, buried alive for betraying the vow that defined her role. Now we move on to number 11. The boats. We now reach one of the most disturbing and controversial execution methods ever mentioned in ancient texts, often called the boats. Although historians still debate the accuracy of these accounts, the descriptions passed down through the centuries are horrifying. According to these sources, scaphism was used by the ancient Persians to punish the most serious offenders. Plutarch, in his writings, described how this method unfolded. The condemned person was placed inside a wooden boat or trough, lying flat. A second boat, with holes left open for the head, hands, and feet, was lowered on top, trapping the victim between the two structures. The torture began when executioners forced the victim to swallow a mixture of milk and honey, causing violent digestive reactions. Then, they smeared the same sticky mixture over all exposed skin. Once coated, the helpless prisoner was pushed out onto stagnant water or left in the open sun. This environment attracted insects. Flies swarmed to the sweet mixture, laying eggs in wounds and bodily openings. The trapped person could not move or escape. As days passed, waste accumulated beneath them, which attracted even more insects. Slowly, the victim was eaten alive by swarms of bugs, dying through a combination of exposure, infection, and prolonged torment. One of the most cited stories is the execution of Mithra, a soldier who allegedly killed the brother of Persian king Artaxerxes. According to ancient writers, he survived an unimaginable 17 days inside the boats before finally dying. Yet many scholars question whether scaphism truly occurred as described. The original texts are lost, and later accounts depend heavily on second-hand sources, some written centuries after the events. Whether fully factual or exaggerated, the description alone is horrifying enough to earn its place among history's most terrifying punishments. Now we advance to number 10. Crucifixion stands as one of the most infamous and agonizing execution methods in world history. Originally practiced by ancient empires such as the Assyrians and Babylonians, the technique spread across civilizations and endured for centuries. Its brutality and public nature made it a powerful tool of intimidation, guaranteeing its place among the most feared punishments ever devised. The Persians, the empire of Alexander the Great, and even the Phoenicians who later introduced it to Rome in the 3rd century B.C. helped spread the brutal tradition of crucifixion across the ancient world. The very purpose of crucifixion was to create slow, unbearable suffering rather than a quick death. The condemned person was secured to a wooden structure, usually in the form of a cross. Sometimes they were tied, but often iron nails were hammered through the bones just beneath the wrists. This placement was deliberate. It avoided cutting major arteries, keeping the victim alive longer, but pierced the median nerve, causing excruciating spasms. The hands would twist inward involuntarily, seizing in agony. The feet were fixed to the upright beam in a similar fashion. As the hours passed, the victim's legs weakened, forcing the arms to bear more and more of the body's weight. This unnatural strain dislocated the shoulders first, then the elbows, and eventually the wrists. The arms could stretch several inches during this process. Once the upper body could no longer lift itself, the chest muscles collapsed inward, making each breath a struggle. Most victims died from slow suffocation, exhaustion, or shock. One of the most well-known historical examples is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ in the 1st century AD. According to historical accounts, he was arrested, tried, flogged, and ultimately executed by the Roman authorities through this method, cementing crucifixion's place as one of the most infamous executions in history. Moving on to number 9. Rat torture. This next method turns a common animal into a tool of unimaginable pain. Rat torture relied on the natural instincts of rat creatures that chew, claw, and burrow to escape danger. In this technique, a live rat was placed inside a small metal or clay container, which was then secured against the victim's abdomen to trigger the rat's panic. The outside of the container was heated with torches, burning coals, or fire. As the temperature rose, the rat desperately sought an escape route, finding none except through the victim's flesh. Driven by terror, it gnawed through skin, muscle, and eventually into the abdominal cavity, inflicting agony beyond comprehension. This horrific method was used for extracting confessions or punishing enemies. Historical records show its use during the 17th century, Dutch revolt, and again centuries later under military dictatorships in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay between 1964 and 1990. No matter the era or location, the cruelty was the same, weaponizing terror and biology to break a human being. Now we proceed to number 8. Number 8. The rack. The rack is one of history's most feared torture devices, notorious for its ability to tear the human body apart without immediately killing the victim. The device consisted of a long wooden frame fitted with rotating axles on each end. The victim was laid flat on the table, arms and legs spread out. Straps or leather bindings secured their wrists and ankles tightly to prevent any movement. Ropes or chains connected these bindings to the axles. As executioners slowly turned the handles, the ropes tightened, stretching the victim's body inch by inch. Vertebrae pulled apart, joints popped out of place, and muscles tore under the strain. Tendons snapped, limbs elongated unnaturally, and bones sometimes shattered from the extreme tension. The rib cage compressed the lungs, making breathing difficult, while exposed nerves sent waves of unbearable pain through the body. The rack didn't just break bones, it destroyed the body's structure entirely, leaving survivors permanently crippled, if they lived long enough to survive at all. The pain inflicted by the rack was so extreme that words can barely capture its magnitude, and if the victim managed to withstand this unimaginable torture, an even more vicious version awaited. In such cases, the prisoner was laid across spiked rollers, which ripped into the flesh of their back as the device turned, shredding skin and muscle with every rotation. Historical accounts confirm the horrifying reality of this device. In 1447, a British constable named John Exeter reportedly used the rack to interrogate prisoners in the Tower of London, one of the most feared structures of its time. Centuries earlier, in 356 BC, the Greeks used a similar torture method on Herostratus, the infamous arsonist who set fire to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. These examples stand as chilling reminders that the rack was not a myth, but a genuine weapon of cruelty. Now we come to number 7. Keelhauling. The drowning torture derived from the Dutch word keel, meaning to drag under the keel. Keelhauling was one of the most terrifying punishments used at sea. The condemned sailor was stripped, bound, and tied to a rope that ran beneath the entire length of the ship. Weights or chains were attached to his legs to ensure he sank below the hull. Once the rope was released, the sailor was dragged underneath the vessel. Nearly all victims died either by drowning or by the violent impact with the ship's underside. The hull of wooden ships was covered in sharp barnacles and rough marine growth, which sliced deep into the skin, leaving gaping wounds. Even if someone miraculously survived the underwater passage, severe infection from the lacerations almost always led to death shortly afterward. Historical documents confirm that the Dutch Navy used keelhauling from the mid-1500s to the mid-1800s. The English Royal Navy also employed the punishment as early as the 11th century, with 17th century writers describing its use in grim detail. The practice dates even further back to 700 BC. The Rhodian Sea Code, Lex Rhodia, specifically listed keelhauling as an official punishment for pirates, highlighting the Greeks' willingness to use extreme measures on the high seas. Next, we move to number 6, the wheel, a spectacle of mutilation. Now we arrive at the infamous breaking wheel, also known as the execution wheel or Catherine wheel. This horrific method of torture appeared throughout the ancient and medieval worlds and was commonly performed in public to instill fear. The torment began by binding the victim to a large wooden wheel fitted with thick spokes. Then the executioner, often skilled in delivering pain slowly, began smashing the victim's limbs with an iron bar. Legs were shattered first, then arms, deliberately avoiding vital organs so the victim would stay alive through the ordeal. After the bones were pulverized, the mangled body was carefully woven between the spokes of the wheel, bending the limbs into unnatural positions. In some variations, the victim's feet were brought up behind the head, contorting the body into a grotesque configuration. Once displayed on the wheel, the victim was left exposed, bleeding and broken, often dying hours or even days later. The breaking wheel became infamous across Europe and beyond, from Austria and France to Germany, the Indian subcontinent, Russia, Scotland, Sweden, and Rome. One of the most haunting accounts comes from 1348, when a man named Boner reportedly endured for days and nights on the wheel before finally dying, the longest survival ever recorded under this brutal punishment. In 2019, archaeologists in Milan uncovered a chilling skeleton that many experts believe belonged to a victim of the breaking wheel. The bones showed unmistakable signs of the brutal injuries associated with this device. With that grim discovery, we now move on to number 5, impalement. A brutal penetration impalement was one of the ancient world's most horrific execution techniques. Used across numerous civilizations, its purposes varied from eliminating criminals to silencing uprisings, punishing deserters, or enforcing military discipline. Regardless of the reason, the method was intentionally designed to inflict maximum terror. There were two primary forms of impalement: longitudinal and transversal. In the longitudinal version, the victim was positioned over a sharpened wooden stake. The stake was driven up through the lower body, but executioners took care to avoid the major organs. This horrifying detail meant that the victim could remain alive for hours or even days, while gravity slowly forced the stake upward until it eventually emerged through the shoulder, neck, or back. In the transversal form, the stake pierced through the torso horizontally, either from the front to the back or vice versa, killing the victim more quickly, but not before causing unbelievable pain. An even more disturbing variant existed, known as gonch. Victims were hurled onto large iron hooks, spikes, or metal rods. Their bodies hung suspended, impaled in brutal fashion, left to die slowly while their tormentors looked on. This form of execution appeared throughout Persia, Mesopotamia, Europe, the ancient Near East, Egypt, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Its widespread use is a testament to how far human cruelty once extended. Now we move to number 4, the blood eagle, unfolding wings of horror. If the punishments so far have been harrowing, the blood eagle may be the darkest of them all. This notorious Viking ritual is still debated by historians, but even the possibility of its existence is deeply unsettling. The blood eagle first appears in late skaldic poetry. According to these descriptions, the victim was laid face down, and the executioners sliced open the back in a precise and deliberate manner. The ribs were then severed from the spine and pulled outward, while the lungs were lifted through the opening, creating the appearance of bloody wings. The sheer agony of such a process is almost unimaginable. It is difficult to believe anyone could remain conscious long enough to witness their own body being torn apart in such a grotesque manner. There is no definitive proof that the blood eagle was ever performed, but its most famous mention is tied to Ivar the Boneless, son of the Viking leader Ragnar Loth. In 867 AD, he is said to have performed the blood eagle on King Glar of Northumbria as revenge for Ragnar's death, reportedly caused by being thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Now we proceed to number 3. Molten gold. A fiery death from within. This method of execution was far more widespread than most people realize, with evidence suggesting its use by both the Romans and the Spanish Inquisition, as well as among indigenous groups in the Americas. That the procedure itself was horrifyingly simple. The victim was restrained, their mouth forced open, and molten gold, heated until it was liquid and blazing hot, was poured directly down their throat. As the metal traveled through the body, it destroyed internal organs instantly. The lungs, throat, and stomach were scalded beyond recognition, resulting in a rapid but excruciatingly painful death. Molten gold created a symbolic punishment as well, representing greed, betrayal, or crimes related to wealth. Few forms of execution combined symbolism and severity so brutally. In 1599, members of the Javaro tribe captured a Spanish governor and executed him in a horrifying fashion by forcing molten gold down his throat. This method was also used in the ancient world. Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, after being defeated and taken prisoner by the Parthians, was reportedly put to death in the same cruel manner. Many believed this punishment was chosen as a symbolic mockery of his famous obsession with wealth. Another Roman commander, Manusac, met a nearly identical fate after being captured by Mithridates VI of Pontus, sealing molten gold as a grim symbol of greed and downfall. Now we proceed to number 2. Flaying, literally removing the skin from a living person, was among the most torturous execution methods ever devised. The suffering occurred slowly and deliberately, making it one of the most feared punishments of the ancient world. The process began with the victim being stripped naked and tightly bound so they could not move. The executioner then used a sharp blade to cut and peel away layers of skin, often starting at the head, so the victim remained conscious during the earliest and most agonizing phase. In some cases, parts of the body were boiled beforehand to loosen the skin, allowing it to be removed more easily. Death came in many forms: overwhelming shock, massive blood loss, infection, or hypothermia. Depending on how methodically the executioner worked, the victim could remain alive for several hours or even days, while their skin was gradually removed. Although flaying appears frequently in popular culture as a medieval European punishment, historians note that it was extremely rare during the Middle Ages. According to Dr. Lissa Tracy, only one confirmed case occurred in Europe between the 11th and 16th centuries, the flaying of Venetian commander Marco Antonio Bragadin by the Ottoman Turks after the fall of Cyprus in 1571 CE. However, flaying was widely practiced in the ancient world. It appeared among the Assyrians, Aztecs, Chinese, and multiple Near Eastern societies. One alleged case involves the philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, who was said to have been skinned by a mob using sharp pottery fragments. But no civilization used flaying more systematically than the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians employed it as both punishment and psychological warfare. Rebels, nobles, and political enemies were often skinned, and their hides were displayed to terrorize others. King Agenisopol II even recorded his own acts, boasting, "I flayed the nobles who opposed me and draped their skins over the piles of corpses. Some I hung on stakes, others I spread out across the walls." For the Assyrians, flaying was not only execution, it was an unmistakable warning, meant to crush resistance before it began. Now we reach number 1. Roman candle, human torches of antiquity. At the very top of this list stands one of the most horrifying execution methods ever used, the Roman candle. This nightmarish punishment is forever linked to Emperor Nero, whose cruelty and violent persecution of Christians became infamous throughout history. During Nero's elaborate nighttime festivities, victims were tied tightly to tall wooden stakes so they could not move. Their bodies were soaked in flammable oil or pitch. Once prepared, the executioners ignited the flames, starting from their feet, stirring a long, agonizing burn. These victims were turned into literal human torches, lighting Nero's gardens as they screamed in unbearable pain. This execution was not just about punishment, it was spectacle and terror used as a political weapon. Many of those condemned were Christians, falsely accused of starting the Great Fire of Rome. The famous painting Nero's Torches captures the horrifying moment when bound victims await the flames, symbolizing the earliest state's pursued persecution of Christians. The Roman candle remains one of the clearest examples of how absolute power, hatred, and human cruelty combined to produce some of the darkest chapters in ancient history.